admiring the various instruments that he had made, we shared the joy of music making. One of the joyful Indians was an apprentice violin maker and showed me one of his projects. The next day began way before sunup. Manuel wanted to beat the heat of the deep canyon we must enter into and climb out of. An Indian brought a mule to replace the burro. The going would be much tougher that day. Our Indian guide led the mule at an unbelievable pace. I took his heart rate once when we stopped. Mine was 130, his was 70. Research has shown that as the Raramuri heart rate increases, their blood pressure decreases. I finally managed to convince Manuel that I could ride and eventually earned the chance to prove it. Riding in this country was challenging, and you had to know when to get on and when to stay off. Manuel would occasionally let me ride on the moderate downhills, but he insisted on riding on the uphills. Nonetheless, it was helpful to have the occasional breaks. The country was steep and the pace brutal. One of the few times our guide stopped to enjoy the view, I found just enough energy to snap this picture. Once in a while, a beautiful scene gave me the excuse to stop, and my guides reluctantly would wait until I finished taking a photo before resuming forward. When we saw the large bill parrots, however, everyone stopped. We also stopped for poisonous snakes. Soon we would make our last climb and be at the top of the canyon, then only several more hours from our destination. When we neared the top, Manuel stopped, took out a razor near this large agave plant used by the Indians to make mezcal wine, and a delicious food that takes more than a week to prepare. He shaved and recommended I do the same. Perhaps the Indians would be more accepting of us if we did not look so much like white men. At long last, we reached the top. The going was now much easier, and Manuel let me ride more often on the downhills. We are now in the heart of Simeron country, the Raramuris who have chosen intentionally not to accept the ways of Christianity, like this woman who is leading an oxen into a field. Just as I was getting used to walking on flat ground, we came to a last hill that caused me to make my first request for a ride on the mule uphill. Manuel graciously accommodated me as he knew I was exhausted. One last stream to cross. We came upon a place where a dam had been built to trap fish. Here, a part of the agave plant would be crushed in the water so that fish entering the barrier containing this toxic potion would be temporarily stunned, just long enough for an Indian to grab it. We stopped by some women who were scraping thorns off of cactus. The pulp from the cactus would later be cooked and pressed into a spicy corn soup. These women, like those I photographed in 1983, were extremely shy and uncomfortable with my presence. This was understandable considering the slavery that they were sold into in the 19th century and the current rash of rape and abuse from the drug cartel. Only a girl of this age was not yet apprehensive of my presence. We came upon more and more rancheros, spread apart by 1 to 3 or 4 miles. We were nearing our destination. Finally, in the late afternoon, we reached a wide, flat plateau. This was the center of the sanctuary the Sierra Madre Alliance, under the direction of Edwin Bustia, had attempted to make for the Indians. Gumercino, the indigenous promoter Edwin had arranged to meet me here so he could introduce me to the Indians, however, was not to be found. Without Gumercino to introduce me to the village, and with Manuel returning to Agua Azul the next morning, I was worried about being accepted by the Indians. I asked Manuel to take me to the home of Augustin Ramos, a 102-year-old shaman Edwin and Randy had told me much about. Perhaps Augustin would be my best entry into the community. We hiked to his house, but he was not there. Instead, Florencia, Juanita, and Concha met us. Florencia's husband had died, and she and her 2 daughters had moved into Augustin's house. I took Polaroid pictures of them and then gave them the pictures, finding this to be an excellent way to show respect. The next morning, sore, tired, and with an Achilles tendon too sore to touch, I found a long stick to use for support and headed off toward Augustine's ranchero again. I bid farewell to Manuel, who was to return for me in 3 weeks, this time with 2 mules. On the way to Augustine's house, I came upon several younger men wearing the usual Western attire and talking to an older man wearing a cotton loincloth, a baseball cap, and a Western-type shirt. The younger men left immediately, but the older man remained, washing something in the stream he knelt beside. Without asking, I knew instantly this was Augustine. Respectfully, I stood back and waited for him to acknowledge me. I knew he knew I was there, and surely Florencia had told him about me, and that I was a friend of Edwin's. Instead of acknowledging me, however, he stood and walked off. I hobbled after him without trying to speak, as if I knew this was the right thing to do. Not really knowing if I'd have another chance, I took this photo as covertly as possible while limping behind him. Several miles later, we arrived at another ranchero, and Augustine began helping his neighbor put a wooden yoke on 2 oxen. I acted as though I were with Augustine and said hello to the younger man in the traditional way with Guadiba. He smiled and greeted me with the touch of 3 fingers. After the leather bindings were used to strap the oxen together, this oak branch was fashioned into a plow and was attached to the log that joined the oxen together. The men started plowing the field and planting corn. After an hour or so, I elected to join in, limp and all, and helped plant seeds. Others had also joined the workforce and seemed to appreciate my efforts. They laughed uproariously when they saw me planting 5 or 6 seeds of corn instead of the usual 3 or 4 required to coincide with the number of souls that men and women have. Still laughing, they made sure, however, I was doing it right. Keeping up with the plow, especially with my hurt leg, took all my concentration, so counting out the right number of kernels was not as easy as it sounds. After several hours, the field was planted and the men removed the oak plow. Augustine then lifted the 100 or so pound object onto his shoulder and headed off towards another plot of land nearly half a mile away. I followed, then boldly offered to carry it for him. He allowed for the favor and guided me to our destination. I tried not to show my own pain and exhaustion. The other men brought the oxen behind us, and the process of planting was repeated. We worked until the entire second field was planted. For the first time, Augustine acknowledged my presence with a genuine smile that made the whole day a success for me. I went to my watering hole and filled my canteen, and then retired to my camp to eat, brush my teeth, and collapse like a dead man into my sleeping bag. The next morning, I slept late and missed Augustine, who had already left for his day of helping his neighbors. So I helped Concha and Juanita feed goat milk to the puppies in a very direct way. This assures that the dogs protect the goats by keeping pumas and coyotes away. I also helped rebuild the corrals so the goat dung would fertilize another patch of cornfield. This was done approximately every 2 or 3 days. I also made fires for cooking in the earthenware pots the women made from the clay, and hauled firewood, although I could not carry nearly as much at one time as Juanita or her mother could carry. I helped gather a variety of plants like the agave for food preparation. The Indians use more than 300 varieties of plants for food, spices, and medicine, although this variety is rapidly dwindling throughout the Sierra Madre. My reward was participation in Augustine family meals, which were absolutely delicious. I ate there so often I began giving away my backpack food to the Indians. The next morning, and all the mornings thereafter, I was up early enough to catch Augustine and follow him on his daily excursions. I helped him help the children pick plants. and helped him help others shuck the dried corn off of the cobs. I even napped when he napped. Then something very strange occurred. Near the end of my first week, I sat with Augustine after he had cured a little girl of a fever with peyote and chanting. While we sat across from one another, he began to talk to me with his thoughts. They were beamed into my brain as clear messages that I seemed to understand before my mind could translate them into words. In amazement, I recorded the messages and my reaction to the phenomenon onto my tape recorder later that evening. We would continue such dialogue for the remainder of our visit. The next morning I missed Augustine, but followed an intuitive feeling, hiking along the small trail for several miles to a new ranchero. A Tesquina gathering was going on, and for the first time since my arrival, I seemed to be welcomed by the Indians. They offered me a gourd of warm corn beer, which I sipped until they urged me to drink the entire gourd at once. Inside, Augustine was blessing people one after another with 2 wooden crosses he would occasionally dip into the beer. Mistakenly referred to as crucifixes by anthropologists, these crosses were pre-Christian and represented connections with the heavenly spirit and the earthly nature on the long vertical axis and the health and illness on the horizontal axis. After I had drunk several bowls of Tesquina, Augustine walked past me, smiled, and spoke to me out loud for the first time. He tapped me on my heart and spoke a short sentence with a gleam in his eye I will never forget. Then he spoke to me once again without words, and I understood his message. Eventually, Gumersindo returned. When he first saw me, he looked dangerously at me and went into his house to retrieve a pistol. I gave him a letter of introduction written by Randy, and several members of the community came to him and talked to him about me. In a few moments, he grinned and invited me warmly into his house for tortillas. I could see that he was in pain, and asked him if Augustine could help. He nodded, and I ran for Augustine, finding him strangely just where I knew he would be, at a place I had never been before. Augustine followed me and treated Gumersindo's broken ribs by applying peyote wrapped in a handkerchief. Although Punta, the little dog that had adopted me, ate the corn we used to try to catch the chicken with, the bird was soon caught and a pot of water was put on the cooking fire. Gumersindo was amazed at the way Augustine communicated with me. The chicken dinner would be a celebration. I was elected to pluck the feathers after dunking the freshly killed bird briefly into hot water to loosen them. For my remaining days with Augustine, he and I had many conversations using the strange telepathic format, although I never learned from him how to make sense of this calendar. He did teach me much about the Raramuri spiritual connection with the universe, however. The ladder on this Indian's grave, for example, is intended to help them climb to the next level. One morning, Augustine and I spent over an hour playing with a dead mole and laughing while we took turns making it sing and dance. I set the camera on a hoe I had been using to rake the goat dung into the ground in order to take this photo. Our relationship had truly reached significance. On the first full moon night in May, Augustine invited me to participate in the annual peyote ritual. I was told later by Edwin that such an offer to an outsider had never been before made by Augustine. From this point on, the entire community seemed to accept me as a friend. I joined them in their numerous games and laughed when they laughed. The teenagers especially enjoyed playing games. These rocks were thrown from more than 50 yards away in a game that resembles horseshoes. My favorite game to watch was a game called Romavoya, a sort of dice game used with marked sticks that were bounced from a rock towards one's opponent. A rock placed in holes in the dirt kept score, and much gambling took place with this very complicated game. On some days, men came from miles away to play the games, like this coin-throwing game that resembled horseshoes also. One man came from an area where drug traffickers were prevalent, and he kept his gun tucked into his pants. One Sunday, families from the entire village appeared, finding places to sit in various areas so they could watch the Arahipa runners pass by. Some sat in groups and chatted, others sat alone. The Arahipa runners kick a wooden ball and carry a stick for removing it from cactus when necessary. Shamans cure their legs, and the entire community participates by keeping track of the ball, by offering pinole made from corn flour, or by rubbing sore muscles with a mixture made from the sinawawa root. The wooden ball is tossed, not actually kicked, with the foot, and some runners run with only one sandal, keeping their kicking foot free. At the end of a race, bets are collected, but no one pays much attention to the winning runner. He's left alone after his great physical effort, which could be as many as 2 or 3 days of running. His winning is not important. It's taken for granted that someone will win, and everyone just tries their best. The kickball game is played very often. Some are short, perhaps only 10 kilometers, and others, as I mentioned, last for days. The runners run through the night carrying pitch pine torches, carrying deer antlers on their sides to keep them awake. The kickballs are carved from oak or madrone. Sometimes the game actually begins with runners locating an ideal hunk of wood and carving the ball. This particular game ball was kicked up and down terrain that went from 3,000 feet to 8,000 feet and back down for nearly 40 miles. While waiting for the runners to return, these young girls ran back and forth with their version of the running game. Using 2 curved sticks and a hoop, they tossed the hoop ahead of themselves. These girls ran approximately 15 miles in their dresses as usual, while I watched in amazement. Juanita was an excellent runner. Gumercino started a rumor in the village that she was to become my wife, and I felt the rumor had reached her. Although she was only 14 years old, I must admit she was an excellent cook. I was now being invited to all the festivals, and music was a part of each of them. Although not for entertainment, music was for sharing joy with the great Mother-Father God, Onoruame. Although the flute's a relatively new instrument for the Raramuri, it has become a part of their culture and blends nicely with the steady beat of the Tarahumara drum. The oldest known melody instrument that Raramuris play is called the shaparike. I continued my apprenticeship with Augustine. This man, Perfidio, was one of our patients. He had suffered a compound fraction of the leg shortly before I arrived, and now